It's just really, really great to be here. So I'm going to be talking a bit about the business case for ICT accessibility. You've heard a lot from Christopher and from Carolyn. You've seen all kinds of examples of assistive technology. And so we're going to move in this session, and we're going to be covering a couple of different things. Okay. So what we're going to be talking about is the case for accessibility, and we're going to be looking at that from a couple of different angles. And we're also going to be talking about web accessibility tips, tools, and strategies, things that you can use and take back to your own work environment, and some accessibility resources. One of the things that we really hope is going to happen today, after you've heard all of our sessions, you go back to your respective agencies and share with them what you've learned today and what we've shared with you. And we would like for you to be able to then come to GTA, come to Access GA, simply by going to our website, accessga.org, and on that you'll see an open blank form where you can file a request. You can make a request for assistance. If you need assistance in accessibility training, if you need assistance in our looking at your website for accessibility. And of course, as Christopher mentioned and Nikhil mentioned, GTA, AMAC, and the State ADA Coordinator's Office, we're all working together to give you technical assistance and to help you and people in your department really understand and implement all these wonderful things that you're learning today. And we're going to have an assignment at the end of the day that you can take back with you. I see some smiles saying, yay!
Homework.
Good homework, but it's going to be fun information. So I'm going to move on with sharing some of this great information for you. When you talk with your departments about accessibility, you want to think in terms of all the reasons why it's important. You know, it's just the right thing to do. But if you break it down and you look at the economics of it, accessibility benefits everybody. Think for a moment when you use a ramp. That's good for people with strollers. It's good for people who are having, briefcases on rollers like I use all the time. It's good for delivery people. It's good for people in wheelchairs, moms with strollers. Everybody can use ramps. So when you think about information and communication technology, what's really important is just think about, it's the same thing. When you go to the internet, when you use web resources, when you read a document, if you're a person using a screen reader, or like Liz, using voice input technology, you want to be able to get around it. You want to be able to see it. And that's so very important. The legal reasons and mandates. Mike touched upon this. We're going to go into this and dive a little deeper today, but you're going to really understand more about why the law really says, this is something we have to do. And more is coming that we can expect in the future. You'll learn more about what Mike touched upon, the 508 refresh. And then there are technological reasons. Accessibility is just becoming readily available for everybody. I mean, how many people here use iPhones? Well, guess what? That's a computer. My husband has been in the computer industry for years and has actually worked on the 508 committee to develop the law. And when he'll be 71 this year, right? And so when he first worked with computers, everything he did that took up thousands of square feet of space, all of that today is in a smartphone. And that's pretty incredible. Everything keeps getting smaller and smaller, and yet more powerful and more powerful. And all of these things are interconnected now. Everything's interconnected. Increasingly, if you have kids in the school system, you're going to find that they're going to be using computers more and more and more. I see people nodding their heads. That's happening. And so all of this is so important for accessibility. Carolyn and Liz mentioned earlier ago that there are different versions of how many people with disabilities out there. The one I saw most recently is nowadays with the amendments to the Americans with Disabilities Act that happened about a year or so ago, is more people are eligible under the ADA now, and they don't have to file as much paperwork to qualify as a person with a disability if they needed to file a complaint. It's much easier for people to do that now with the amendments. And so there are a greater number of people who fit that definition, and now we say there's 60 million people. And for most of us, it's about 1 out of every 2 Americans is affected either directly or indirectly by a disability. And we touched on how the aging and the baby boomers, I'm a boomer, anybody else a boomer, you don't have to raise your hand. Woohoo! It's like, I get to get my Medicare card in February. I'm not sure I'm excited about that, but it's the truth. And I'm still working. And there are many people who are older who are going to continue to work. And you'll see some information that is very compelling about the need for accessibility for older people. The other thing is building accessibility from the start is much easier. It is much easier to build a building that is accessible from the very beginning, with one no-step entrance, with bathrooms you can maneuver. How many of you have been in, for instance, restrooms where people have tried to retrofit it and sort of kind of make it accessible, and maybe it fits the ADA guidelines, but wow, it's not elegant, right? Same thing with information and websites. You want your sites to be accessible, usable, and that makes them absolutely elegant. So when we look at the working age adults with disabilities, one of the things that we find, and this data, if you can read it all, it's from 18 years all the way to over 75 years. And what do you see happening here? Okay? As you get older, there are more people who have disabilities, more people who have different issues that are affecting them, and it really kind of jumps up in the 55 and older age group, and with more and more people working, then that becomes an issue. So good accessibility, as I said, it's good for everybody. It's more usable. It gives you compliance with the federal law. It increases optimization on your website for your search engine. One of the things it said is if you're accessible, you want to have search features on every single page. It'll just be so much more usable for everybody. And it improves the interoperability, how all these things work together. I know at Georgia Tech, if I try to do some of the forms that I have to fill out for travel, if I use one particular browser like IE, it won't work. If I go into Firefox, guess what? Safari works, no problem. Well, when you're using screen readers like you saw today, that issue becomes even more profound. And so by working on accessibility, overall accessibility, it's going to improve the accessibility of everything. And that's going to expand your audience, not only the audience of people that you're serving, because all of us are public agencies, right? So we're public facing, and it's important that all those people out there, regardless of their abilities, can use and access the services that you're offering. Same thing with employees with disabilities as well. So we talked about older people, people with disabilities. Who are some of those other folks that we know about? People where English is their second language. If sites are designed with them in mind, and you've got things like captioning for your videos, that's going to help people who need that as well. And persons with lower literacy levels are going to benefit from it, and all your staff and customers. I'm not going to show this video because I know we had a few little issues before. I just don't want to get stuck with it, but I'm going to describe and give you a sort of an audio description of this picture. This was taken in Paris, in the Louvre. If you ever have an opportunity to go to Paris and go to this beautiful art museum, you will see that there is a circular stairway, and in the middle of it is an elevator. And guess what? The elevator goes up and down. And so people can use the stairway to go around, and they can use the elevator to go up and down. It's like an integrated design. And that's the kind of mindset you want to think about. I mean, how many times have you, if you have kids and you have a stroller, or you're in the department store and you need to use the elevator, and you can't find it. It's not there by the escalators, right? Or the stairs. So these are design concepts, and it's really, you know what, and Mike will take argument with me, it's really not about the law. It's about a mindset, okay? It's a mindset. All of us have different abilities. And so if we begin to think about that as our mindset, we want everybody to be able to access our benefits, our services. That's where we need to go with it. I'm going to show you a couple of slides that'll give you some pictures of what it's like with certain kinds of disabilities when you look at a screen. For people in diabetes, you know, that's one of the most common disabilities that people get, especially as they get older. And one of the most common things that happens with diabetes is it can affect your eyesight. So this is a screenshot of somebody, you know, you see two different images here. Little boys playing with a ball, and you can see that very clearly. Hopefully you can all see that very clearly. On the right, you see some of those images are blacked out. And that's what diabetic retinopathy does to your vision. With older people working in the workforce, we can probably expect that, you know, those are going to be some of the issues. And so they're going to have an alternative way to see what's on the screen. For people who are aging and who are beginning to get cataracts, this gives you an idea of what it looks like if you're looking at a screen display and you've got a cataract. And if you see on the right, there's sort of a hazy glare area. That happens with cataracts, and it's duller, there's some blurring there, it's gray. And then for people who are legally blind, 20/20, 20 over 200, that's the definition of legal blindness. All right? And so for somebody who's legally blind without any kind of correction looking at a screen, this is what it's going to look like. This is what you're going to see. So we're going to talk a little bit about the changing legal landscape of web accessibility for state government agencies. And we touched on Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act and settlement agreements between the U.S. Department of Justice and various public entities. When I was doing some research about this, I happened to see that the Department of Justice had a settlement agreement with the city of Atlanta. And in it, one of the things that was cited was web accessibility. Now, there was no complaint made here. It's just the U.S. Department of Justice periodically will do an evaluation and make recommendations. It's really from the standpoint of, you know, helping you understand what are some of the things that you need to address. The other thing that was announced was the Department of Justice, and this was in, oh goodness, I think back in 2010 or 2012, an advance notice of proposed rulemaking for web accessibility. Now, it was announced in the Federal Register, and basically what the DOJ is saying is that, you know, we're going to give you guidance at some point that will be more formal about web accessibility and what you need to do. And that hasn't come out yet. The advance notice that they will be doing some rulemaking has come out. Section 504 of the Rehab Act of 1973, and that's another law that talks about, you know, you can't discriminate based on disability. And then also states receiving funding through the Assistive Technology Act. And that includes Tools for Life. Tools for Life is an ATAC-funded entity. All states have funding through the Assistive Technology Act to help people understand and learn about assistive technology and gain greater access to it. Well, back in the 1990s, all the governors in every single state were asked to produce a letter that said all states would comply with Section 508, and that included Georgia. Otherwise, the state AT programs wouldn't get their funding. Now, that's not been challenged in a court of law or anything like that, but it's just one more of the building blocks that says, you know what, we need to do this from a legal standpoint. And then Section 508, we've touched on that. Section 508 is a part of the Rehab Act amendments of 1998. And basically what it says is electronic information and data must be equally accessible to people with disabilities. And in this presentation, you can look at this later on. You can go to the reference here. That's a hyperlink. And you can see that it will give you standards for electronic accessibility. And they're written in a very clear and concise way. They're very, very well done. And then there are also guidelines that discuss each one of those standards a little bit more fully. So when you look at this PowerPoint, you'll have access to this in several different ways. We'll have it on our wiki at accessga.org, and I know Pooja is making that available to everybody as well. And so you'll be able to look at that and understand that more specifically. So let's take a minute and look at what does Section 508 cover. And if you were to pull up that website that I just shared with you, you would find that there are all these different sections. The numbers on the left refer to specific sections in that law. And so, for example, one of the sections refers to software apps and operating systems, and then there are web-based intranet and internet information about how you can be accessible there, standards for telecommunication products like mobile phones, etc., video and multimedia products. We have lots of that today. And then self-contained closed products. And those are the things that Christopher showed you in the early one when you looked at the kiosks. It also refers to faxes, but fax machines. Now, 508, that was published a long time ago. So very few people use electronic fax machines the way we used to. But all of those are self-contained closed products. And what that really means is it's not something where you can use the product with a screen reader like you've seen, or necessarily voice input technology. Although, I will tell you that back this year, I was looking at a new product that Canon is coming out with, and guess what? It has voice input controls. So it's very, very exciting. And then also desktop and portable computers. So when you go into the Section 508 standards, you'll see very good, clear descriptions about what you need to be doing in each of those areas. Now, how many of you, are there anybody in here who's a website developer? Anybody? Okay, I see a couple of hands. Okay, so for you folks, Section 508, the 1194-21, software apps and operating systems, and then the one following on web-based intranet and internet. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at those, but those are the ones you're going to be most interested in. And in the current Section 508, that applies to federal government agencies. Those two are separated. In the Section 508 refresh, which is something that we expect will be produced or published by the U.S. U.S. Access Board sometime. We've been waiting on it for many years, but everybody thinks that it's going to be refreshed very soon, that those sections above will be combined in the new 508, in the refresh. And also, it will include Section 255 of the Telecommunications Act. And that's because so much of our technology, it will do multiple different kinds of things. So those are going to be together in the new one. When we look at the 508 refresh, the U.S. Access Board, as I mentioned, is updating their 508 standards. And they're doing this to ensure consistency of coverage of telecommunication technologies and products. And that's why 255 is going to be included in that. The Telecommunication Act accessibility guidelines and 508, the current, still remains in effect until the refresh happens. Now, what's interesting is February, almost a year ago, the Access Board, and the Access Board is what really develops the standards, the 508 standards. They developed that before, and they're working on the refresh. And so February a year ago, they actually submitted a proposal to update and do the refresh, Section 508 standards and the Telecommunication Act. And they submitted that to the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. That's a federal government agency. OMB has to actually review that and clear that. So they should be in the process of doing that now. And once they've agreed on everything, and there are many people with disabilities and many experts in the telecommunications and computer world, ICT world, who are working on this refresh. It's not something that happens in the Beltway with a small group of people. There have been many people involved in this. Then that rule is going to be published in the Federal Register. And when that happens, you will have an opportunity to review that and to make comments about it. And so if you're one of those people that's really into web development, you need to pay attention to that and talk with people Access GA, I think some of you may have gotten our news brief. GTA is making sure that that is something that you have opportunity to see. When the refresh comes out, we'll definitely be dedicating that news brief to more specifically to that refresh, and we'll probably do a webinar regarding that. So that's very exciting. Okay, Section 255 of the Communications Act, as amended by the Telecommunications Act of 1996, it requires telecommunication products and services to be accessible to people with disabilities. Accessibility guidelines issued by the board under Section 255 will address those telecommunication products covered, and it includes so many different products. Wired, wireless telecommunication devices, so telephones, payphones, we don't see those too much anymore, right? Cellular phones, pagers, fax machines, and other products that have telecommunication service capabilities such as computers and modems. So it's like everything we use, right? Communication that carriers also use to provide services such as phone switching equipment. So it's pretty darn expansive. Let's take a step back. Now, we've talked a bit about some of the federal regulations, and then again, you may be asking, well, I work for the state. I don't work for the federal government. You still have ADA, and ADA says you got to provide equal access. It doesn't tell you how to do it when it comes to ICT, information and communication technology. We've got that with the 508 standards. Well, we also have other criteria that we can use. What accessible means in the ICT world is, and really beyond that, is compliance to a standard that specifies testable success criteria. So you've got to have, what are the criteria for saying that, something's accessible or not? 508 gives you that from the federal standpoint. The 508 standards do. But in addition to that, there's a group, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and that's pronounced WCAG 2.0. It talks about success criteria of websites that will be at up to 3 levels of compliance. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, because I know for those of you who are not into web and IT, ICT kinds of issues, some of this might be, gosh, there's so much to this. So there's a group called the World Wide Web Consortium. How many people have heard about the W3 Consortium? Okay, about a handful of people. Well, you can imagine, here we are in the U.S., we have these wonderful laws, but what about the rest of the world? There are experts from around the world that have been working ever since the internet was developed to understand how is a person who's blind or somebody who needs to use voice input going to use the web, and how are they going to be able to access all this wealth of information around the world. And so this World Wide Web Consortium, which is based out of MIT, involves people from around the world, and they establish the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 2.0. Now that's the second version. There was a 1.0. And there are committees, just as we speak, that are continuing to work on this. We've been invited to participate at AMAC on the committee that is actually working on if you have a cognitive disability, learning disability, what have you, what are some of the things that need to be addressed in these guidelines. And so if you were to look at Section 508 and the WCAG guidelines, you would see, if you looked at them together, there is some harmonization. There's certainly a lot of crossover, but there are also some differences. So for example, if your agency said, well, we're going to hire one of the firms out there, there's several different private firms, and to do a website evaluation of our site to see how accessible it is, or even if you went to Access GA, we would generate a report, and we would show you where you're meeting 508 guidelines. We would show you where you're meeting the WCAG guidelines, and we would also include some comments about usability that goes beyond the guidelines, things that you need to fix to make things accessible to people with disabilities. So that's very good. If you're a newcomer in this area and you're wondering, my goodness, when you look at these guidelines, they get very, very deep, very, very deep. I'm going to go through a few tips that if you do some of the tips that I've talked about, you're going to probably catch 90% of the issues going on with your website. And if you were to start and look at these guidelines and look at your website against the guidelines, start with 508 standards. And then as you gain experience, then go into WCAG 2.0. All right, so what is accessible web design anyway? What does that mean? It means that people with disabilities can use the web, and that people with disabilities can, and there are four verbs that are very important here, that they can perceive, that you can perceive it, meaning that you can see it, you can hear it. 2, you can understand it. It's up there, you can see it, you can hear it, but does this make any sense? 3, you can navigate it. You can get around. You don't have to use a mouse. There's another way to navigate that website, and it's in a logical order. And that you can interact with the web. And we touched earlier on forms, for example. You know, sometimes people with disabilities can get to information on the web, but using a form becomes a challenge. And so you also want to think about all the different kinds of content that you have on your website. You've got information up there probably about services, right? Resources, including links to other sites. Now, you can't guarantee that the other sites are going to be accessible, right? That's one of the limitations we face. Forms and tables, pictures, images, and videos. Okay, we talked about homework. There are 2 different homework pieces that you can look at. Okay, this is a voluntary action plan for web accessibility. This is a takeaway. You can use this and take this back to your agency and say, these are the things that we need to do so that right now when we have people with disabilities and customers with disabilities, and when the refresh comes, we're going to be ready. We will be ready. First of all, you want to have a policy that your web pages will be accessible, and you want to have that up front and center. When you go, a great example of a policy is the one on the GTA website. I love the GTA website policy. Take a moment, go there, take a look at it. You could probably, you know, if your agency doesn't have it, look at that as something that you could replicate. You want to also be sure that all your new and modified pages and content are accessible. And you'll learn more about that today. You want to develop a plan that includes some priorities, because you're not going to change everything at once, for making your content more accessible. You know, who needs to be involved, what needs to be done. You will probably need to evaluate that to see what the accessibility issues are, and then take it from there. You also want to ensure that your staff and your third-party vendors, your contractors. How many of you are working with government sites where you're using maybe a third-party vendor for some applications or websites? Okay, you probably are. I mean, the state is so many agencies, there's so many applications. And so you want to make sure that they're trained in web accessibility. You want to be sure that in the vendor contracts that you have an accessibility provision. And we've actually helped a couple of state agencies in looking at what kind of language you need to put there. So if you need help with that, we'd be happy to talk with the folks in your contract department, procurement, what have you. And I know you work with DOAS a lot, and so I guess that responsibility would fall on them for, you know, major kind of IT purchases. But even so, if you're making other kinds of purchases that are legal and outside of DOAS, you need to know that. You want to post a telephone number and email for users needing accessibility help to use your web page. Sometimes you find that under the accessibility policy. You're right front center on your homepage. It should be right up there. You know, something, a phone number and an email address preferably, so that if somebody is using a screen reader or some other kinds of assistive technology and they're having a problem, they've got somebody to call for help. That's one of the things that's very important. And then you can use Access GA, or anybody else for that matter, with web testers who use assistive technology. and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but we actually work with web testers like John Rempel that you saw, who actually are very proficient in using the web and using assistive technology, and they go through websites and they can look for these errors. They try to interact with forums and see what they can do, and they'll pinpoint some of the issues that relate to the compliance standards. So here are some tips of things that you can do with your website. You want to, first of all, plan, structure, and navigation. So many of you are probably working with GTA and using their absolutely wonderful, marvelous Drupal accessible template, and that's great. With Drupal, you can also upload content. So if your content is not accessible, even though the template has accessibility features, then you're still going to have a problem. Nora will be talking a lot more about that. So you want to have a logical order and use headings, heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, because what will happen if I'm a person who's blind, I'm using a screen reader, and I'm reading this content, and all of a sudden there's an underlying heading that says 1, but then it jumps to 3, and it doesn't make any sense. And furthermore, it's not like you would look at it where you're reading from left to right or up and down. It's like somewhere else on the page. It's just not a logical reading order. So you want to plan for that. The reading order should match the visual order. You want to include a search feature on each page so people can easily get to that. And you want to, an easy way that you can check to see about your website is just pull out your mouse and use your tab key and see, is it following a logical order? If it does, then that's what a blind person would probably see using a screen reader. All right, so colors, contrasts, and fonts. You want to use good color contrast. How many of you have been to websites where, and for me, being a little bit older and using my glasses now, I look at a website and there's this gray. It's like gray on gray, and you have to really squint to see it. Have you seen websites like that? It's like elegant, right? But it's not very usable. It's not accessible. So you want to use good color contrast. You want to avoid yellows, greens, and reds, because yellows are hard to see when you have visual issues, and also greens and reds for people who are colorblind, they're just not going to get it. You want to avoid using colors alone to convey information. For example, how many times when you order something on the internet, you get to something on the form and there's a red asterisk there, and it means that you either have to fill it out or you don't, one of those. Well, if you're colorblind, you can't see that. If it doesn't have a way to describe it, you don't know what that is. Use true text and not text images. So if you use a text image and you were to enlarge it with a screen reader, in other words, a picture of text, you would see the pixelations, all right? So that's very hard to read if you're a person with low vision, all right? But if you use just true text, like your fonts, then you're going to be okay. You don't want to use a font size that is smaller than 10, and you want to avoid use of multiple caps on the line. And so the other thing you want to do is create descriptive hyperlinks. And I've had some of those in my presentation. Remember when we were talking about the 508 standards, the guidelines, and rather than having just a URL there, it said what it was. So a person using a screen reader needs to understand what it is that you're hyperlinking to. And there are ways that you can do that. You want to make sure that the text makes sense on its own, and you want to avoid words like click here or read more. An example of that is in your handouts. For instance, if you were going to a Twitter site, you'd put maybe Twitter in a different color, and people know to go to that. You don't want to have like click here or something like that, because people won't be able to understand what that's all about. You also want to use link focus indicators. I didn't realize what that word meant until a couple of weeks ago, actually. And that it means icons, okay? So you want to use link focus indicators to provide visual cues for the links as well. Now, I'm not going to show this video, but basically when you go into the PowerPoint later on, This video, and we're shifting gears a little bit, it gives you examples of what it's like to watch a video where there's video description, no video description, captioning, no captioning. And it also shows you proper captioning. If you were to look at this video, improper captioning would be where, you've got the text, but it's either not sequenced with the video or you can't really read it. It's not, the contrast is very poor. And so anytime you use video, number one, you got to have it captioned. Two, if there are images that a blind person couldn't tell what's going on, you need some video description in the background. And that is something that AMAC does. We do that for colleges, universities, and if your agency needs assistance with that, we can help with that. The video should be properly audio described, and the video should allow for pause play features. You want to avoid flashing content because people who have seizures, that could create a problem for them. And so these are just some of the high points of things that we see often with websites. You want to use text equivalents for non-text elements. So what does that mean? So for pictures, for images, for charts and graphs, you want to use what is called alt text or alternative text. So that means when somebody gets to that image, underneath it, there's a way to create what is called an alt text description. So when somebody sees a picture of a penguin, and with nothing being there other than the picture of the penguin, they would see underneath that you've created alt text that says this is a colored picture of a penguin. It's a picture of a penguin. And to create that for Word, PDFs, and PowerPoint, you just go right-click on the image, the penguin, for example, and then you'll see Format Image. You select the Web tab, use the minimum number of words to describe this image, and so that helps you with it. If you have problems with it, you can download this. You might have to get an administrator's authorization. If in your state agency, the administrator has to authorize certain downloads. But there's a private group. This is a free tool. It's called the Web Accessibility Toolbar. You can download that and put it on your site, and that will help you with looking at current alt text and what needs to be done. Then you also want to use row and column headers for data tables. There's some really good information in your handouts and takeaways. Basically, you design your tables to read from left to right, and you want to use headers on all the rows, all the columns. Keep the table design simple. You want to associate the cells with proper headers. And there are a lot of good detailed instructions, not only in your handouts, but also a wonderful site that we love, and there's a hyperlink in the presentation at WebAIM for creating accessible tables. So anybody in your organization who's creating content that's used by the public, they need to know about this so that if it's something that's uploaded on your website with a Drupal template, that it's accessible, for people to use. So when you're looking at web content that needs to be accessible, it's just everything. Rich media, accessibility, Adobe PDF forms, Flash, OpenOffice, Word, PowerPoint. All of those need to be accessible. So when we're looking at websites for accessibility, we recommend you just think of the three-legged stool. You want to have a three-step process to look at web accessibility, and we can help you with this. You can use automated checkers that are free, like the one that we've used a lot is Wave, which is Wave Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool. It's a free download. If you go to the site, you can see the icon below. You will see a little space where all you have to do is load in your URL. So one of the things that might be fun for you to do is go back to your website, the one that your agency is using or one that you like. You might even try the CNN website and just go to some different websites and use that tool. And it will give you a profile of error messages when there are things that need to be fixed, and they'll be flagged, and then it will give you some instructions as to what needs to be changed. How do you, not necessarily how you would do the coding to change it. You know, that's where your programmers come into play, your web developers. But it'll give you those error message, and it's really fun to do that because it's amazing when you start to play around with it. You see, oh my gosh, there's so many websites that are really not accessible. So that's where we start. If you were to come to us and say, we want you to look at our website, we would do that. Then we would also do what we call manual checks and keyboard accessibility. Pulling out the mouse, using the tab key, looking at how well this is ordered and navigated, things like alt text and so on. And then you want to use trusted testers who are people who are users of assistive technology. And we have a team of folks who will do that for us. And so those are the 3 steps. I've seen some information where, you know, some people think if we'll just use an automated tester and we'll see what it gives us and then we'll fix that there. Well, guess what? That's only going to get you about a third of the problems that you need to address if your website has some accessibility issues. You really need to do the manual checks, and you need to have a person who is using assistive technology to help you with that. And then there's a huge resource list I've included here. All of these are hyperlinked, so you can go directly to our Access GA website. You can see how there's the place where you can apply for assistance. If you need some assistance, you have some questions. Then there's a web accessibility group from the University System of Georgia. How are we doing, Tom? You there? Okay. And another accessibility site. There are toolbars. There's the Wave Accessibility Evaluation Tool. You can go to WebAIM, and there's actually a checklist of 508 and so on. There are also color contrast analyzers. One that we like is one with the Paciella group. We're developing, as Christopher touched on, a web evaluation testing center at Georgia Tech. And we have a lot of tools that are listed here that we use when we do that. One of the things I talked about earlier is accessibility is really not about a law. It's not about compliance. It is a mindset. All of us need to be engaged in this process. When you go back, you want to bake in accessibility. To make it really work, honestly, I think you need to have people involved in your organization both vertically and horizontally. People from your director's office, which includes your communications group, IT, HR, procurement, all your managers, customer service staff, policy, training, employees, customers, and third-party providers. If you had to start, though, start with your director's office, your IT office, and maybe your communications group. That's where I would start and work with them on that. Here are some other resources that you can use. And thank you very much.